Welcome to Connections Live, our free Noetic webinar series designed to inform, inspire, and deepen your sense of interconnection. My name is Andrea Livingston, and I'm the Associate Director of Engagement and Partnerships here at IONS. We are so delighted that you have joined us for this very special Connections Live, Insights from the Telepathy Tapes with Dr. Diane Hennecy Powell and Dr. Helané Wahbeh. And as a scientific nonprofit, ION's funding is almost entirely from memberships and donations, and we are so grateful for all of your support. If you are not currently a member, please consider joining us. A membership gives you access to hundreds of hours of video recordings on Noetic topics and the science of consciousness, as well as online and in-person member events. And even more importantly, as a member, you play an integral role in supporting the transformation of consciousness around the globe. So thank you for supporting this frontier research that makes this possible. You can learn more about membership or make a one-time donation to support the work at noetic.org/give. Okay, so now's the time we've all been waiting for. I'm sure many of you are here because you've listened to the Telepathy Tapes, which has just gained widespread attention and features Dr. Diane Hennecy Powell's groundbreaking research on telepathy with nonverbal autistic children. And we're very excited to have Dr. Powell with us today in conversation with ION's Director of Research, Dr. Helané Wahbeh. So I am going to pass it to Helané now, who will provide some context for our conversation and share some insights into telepathy research overall. And then she will introduce our special guest, Dr. Diane Hennecy Powell. So for those of you who may not be familiar with Helané's work, here's a bit of her background. Dr. Helané Wahbeh is the Director of Research at the Institute of Noetic Sciences and an adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Neurology at Oregon Health and Science University. Helané is clinically trained as a naturopathic physician and research trained with a Master of Clinical Research and 2 postdoctoral research fellowships. She has published and spoken internationally about her studies on complementary and alternative medicine, extended human capacities, stress and post-traumatic stress disorder, and their relationship to physiology, health, and healing. Helané is especially known for her research around a Noetic approach to channeling. So Helané, we are so glad you're here with us today, and over to you now.
Thank you so much, Andrea. It is such a pleasure for me to be here with all of you today and with my special guest, Dr. Diane Hennecy Powell. I really wanted to begin our time together today by kind of grounding us in this idea of telepathy and exactly what is telepathy. So Frederick William Henry Myers was one of the principal founders of the Society of the Psychical Research, and he coined that term telepathy in 1882. And he described it as the communication of impressions of any kind from one mind to another, independently of the recognized channels of sense, or 5 senses. And so now the telepathy tapes have just exploded around the world. And often the question is, well, how common is this? Is this real? What is telepathy? So we've actually done a number of surveys at IONS looking at this phenomenon of experiencing mental impressions from other people. And of course, these are usually in speaking individuals rather than non-speakers that we're going to talk about later. But you see here where this red box is, this is a list of 25 different psi experiences. And out of the, almost 3,000 people that took this particular survey, about 1,600 of them said that they've had a telepathic experience. We did another study with scientists and engineers, people from the general public, and also enthusiasts. And you see this red box here. The question was, felt as though you were in touch with someone when they were far away from you. And these are the percentages of the people who actually endorsed that they've had this experience. And in the enthusiasts, it was as high as almost 84%. Well, we're not the only ones who have looked at how common telepathy is. There have been a number of studies around the world. And you see on this left side, this prevalence is the percent of people that they polled on this phenomenon. And you see that it ranges from about 10% up to 55%. So this is not rare, this experience of telepathy, of mental impressions from another person. So the next question is always, well, is this real? Is this an actual phenomenon, or is there some other explanation for it? There are a number of bodies of literature, of research that have been conducted on telepathy. One of the most famous is the Ganzfeld telepathy protocol, which has been used for decades to see if this very unique experience of being in a kind of a sensory, it's not deprivation, but it keeps the sensory input that you're receiving all the same. So you have this red light, you have these balls over your eyes, you have headphones listening to pink noise. And the idea is that if we could reduce or make same the input that's coming in, that maybe telepathic or psychic impressions would be stronger. So in the classic Ganzfeld experiment, the researcher would be maybe in another part of the building and actually seeing this image and attempting to project this image to the participant. So there have been numerous of these studies for the decades. There was a wonderful review of this by Etzel Cardania in 2018 in the American Psychologist. And he collated all of this information that was actually collated by Storm in a previous meta-analysis. And so if these numbers might be gobbledygook to you, so I want to just explain what this means here. This value that's ES stands for effect size. And effect size is really giving us the effect of this phenomenon. And in this case, it's the accuracy of people being able to know what the researcher was sending to them or what the computer was showing them, etc. And so if we think of our materialist paradigm and that these telepathic impressions would be impossible because our consciousness is stuck in our brain, then these effect sizes really should be 0, but they're not. They're 0.14, 0.13, etc. Now, if you look at all of psychology, these effect sizes usually range from about 0.16 to 0.36. So these are definitely on the lower end, and yet they're not 0. So this is quite significant. If you have any interest in seeing the Ganzfeld, we are actually running an experiment right now, and what we need are skeptics. So if you haven't had any meditation or yoga or a psi experience, or don't believe you do well on a psi task, then please reach out, go to our website, and come help us. Also, there's a whole other body of literature around dream telepathy. So instead of you being in this red light, etc., you'd be asleep, and a researcher might be directing information to you. And again, we see similar effect sizes. This research has been going on for more than 25 years, looking into dream ESP. There's also this whole idea of telephone telepathy. How many of you have heard your phone ring and you've known who it was? Well, this is an incredibly common experience, and there have been a number of studies done, especially by Rupert Sheldrake. And we just completed a study on this as well, where we found that when someone positively intended towards the person they were calling, that they were much more accurate in knowing who was calling them. Another large body of evidence is called the distant mental interactions among living systems, or DMILs. So here's this person sending intention. Here's this person as the receiver. And when we look at the data from when they're sending versus not sending, we see changes in the person's physiology. So this isn't necessarily sending mental impressions, but it's what we call telesomatic, or this feeling in the body when someone's sending. So we're also doing a study on this DMILS, looking at the electrical activity of the stomach. So if you are in California near our lab, we would invite you to check this out and potentially participate. And similarly, we are looking for pairs of partners who have had these telepathic or telesomatic experiences. We're looking for 100 pairs of people, and this study's actually done online, so you don't need to be in California. And the goal is to be able to do future studies with neuroimaging and EEG. So I know that was a lot, but I really wanted to give some background on the bodies of evidence around this, and bringing us now to this incredible work of Dr. Diane and the telepathy tapes in non-speakers. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so I can introduce our guest today. I'm very excited to connect with Dr. Diane Hennecy Powell, who is a neuroscientist and psychiatrist, an author known for her research on telepathic communication and extraordinary human abilities. She has spent over a decade exploring the potential of nonverbal autistic children to communicate telepathically. Dr. Powell's research challenges traditional boundaries and aims to bridge the gap between the scientific and the mysterious, offering fresh insights into the vast potential of the human mind. And as we all know, she is the prominent voice in the Telepathy Tapes podcast, which has really busted this wide open in the world. There's been such a huge explosion of interest in this topic. So welcome, Diane. It is such a pleasure to be here with you today.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yes. So I would love to hear from you a little bit about how you came to be doing work in this area.
Well, my interest in autism really began back in 1986 when I met Oliver Sacks, and I read his book, The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. And in that book, he describes this study that he did with these institutionalized autistic boys who were twins, and they had this game they played in which they would say consecutive prime numbers in the 6 digits. And they had no ability to do mathematics, but they just saw the answers. And he was able to validate their prime number generation to 12 digits. And they did it to 20 digits, but at the time, computers could only validate it to 12 digits. And so here they were exceeding computers at the time in the 60s. And when asked, how is it that they received these these prime numbers, because there's no real good algorithm for prime numbers. And they said, oh, they just saw them. It's that these numbers were just sort of like hanging there in midair. And that they were able to do other savant skills like calendar calculation, telling you what day of the week you were born on, and able to do that for thousands of years, forwards and backwards, and, several other things like that. And I thought, wow, this is what I really want to study, because I was already training in neuropsychiatry at Johns Hopkins. And I went over to London and studied and saw children with autism with Sir Michael Rutter, who was knighted eventually for his work on autism. And so came back to the US, and autism was still pretty rare back then. So when I was on faculty at Harvard, I was focused on other things, but became interested in autism again when it started to open up, when it became possible for people who were autistic to communicate for the first time as a result of computers. And I've always been interested in this because I'm one of these experimentalists who's really also a theoretician. And so I see that it's important to have a working theory and then to design experiments so that you can basically test the theory and evolve it. So when I thought about savant syndrome and I thought about the research that's been done on ESP, I thought these are so similar to one another. I wonder if they're really, the same thing, because in both cases, they're somehow accessing information that is non-local. I mean, we have no idea where that information is. And so I went over to India in 2013 to evaluate these savants over there. And while testing them for your typical kinds of savant skills, like mathematics savants, I was told that, oh, by the way, these children are also telepathic. And I thought, okay, wait a minute. If these children are telepathic, that could be a confounding variable. I mean, how do I know that they're not just getting the answer to that mathematics problem from me? And I came back to the US and I was in an interview on a podcast, and people started to become aware of the fact I wanted to research telepathy. And within just a few months, I received an email from a father of a girl named Haley, who had been independently discovered by two different therapists to be reading their minds. So that's how it all began.
That's amazing. And I know you've been doing this work for a very long time. In fact, when I first started at IONS about a decade ago, you came to our campus and gave a talk about your work there, which is really fantastic. So, prior to the telepathy tapes, what were kind of your biggest challenges in trying to do this research? I mean, I know there's many from multiple avenues.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'd say the major challenge was lack of funding.
Is a very common experience in parapsychology research.
It is, and it's particularly problematic for the kind of research that I was trying to do, because none of these children live locally. And so it requires traveling to wherever they are and staying in a hotel. And then because seeing is believing, I knew that I would have to have some kind of visual recording of what was going on. And I would have to really cover the room comprehensively. I mean, it's not okay to just come back with video from one angle. And I needed cameras mounted in different locations. And so that was really my biggest challenge was the funding issue.
Right. Well, hopefully that's shifting with all this great attention. And so for those of you who haven't listened to the telepathy tapes, I would highly, highly recommend it. It's incredibly well done and profound in the implications that we see with these non-speakers. And so, there is, in the podcast, you talk about this in a few different times about the challenge of doing research with the non-speakers. And, there are certain standards around conducting rigorous studies and having rigorous controls. And yet there's so many limitations with that and working with this population. And so what do you think is most important for the audience to know about around that? And, what do you envision is like the most ideal controlled experiment that you could actually do?
Well, first of all, let me talk about what the nature of the communication disruption is in these children who are they're labeled non-speakers. Some of them are unreliable speakers, is what they're called, or minimally speaking. So they can utter some sounds, but you can't really have them talk like people who don't have this communication disorder. And the source of it is it really varies. It's not the same in each child, but I'd say that one of the most common sources of it is that they have a sensory motor issue. And what that means is that their motor system is not informed by their sensory system that tells them where their body is located in space. Again, that's what we call proprioception. So if you ask them about it, they'll say, I don't know where my hands are, or that I didn't even know I had hands. And yet you're wanting them to point to letters on a letterboard or type into a keyboard. And so that's a challenge that they have. And and I think it really actually could be, that challenge could actually be part of why they're able to do this. I mean, I started to suspect that they really are not in their body entirely. And when I asked them that directly, they light up and they were like, "Yeah, you get it." And then they would describe how they really weren't in their body. And so in here, yet we're asking them to be in the body enough to be communicating while being out of the body to do the telepathy. So it's challenging in and of itself. And then the other thing is that the non-speakers generally, I'd say all of them regressed at some point during development, usually within the first 2 years of life while they were acquiring language. And they're so dependent upon their caregiver for everything. They can't really even take care of basic needs. And so there's this type of relationship they have with the caregiver that's kind of like they're perennially in the age of being a toddler in the sense of how dependent they are. And so it can be really hard to get the kind of separation that you would like and be, a stranger that shows up and says, "Okay, I want you to be in this room while your mother is in this room. And then, oh, by the way, demonstrate telepathy and, we're going to have cameras on you." And I mean, it's a lot to ask.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And so, as you're thinking about future research, what do you have in your mind as kind of like the most ideal situation that you could set up to be able to test this further?
Well, given the limitations that I just mentioned, I've been giving it a lot of thought over the years, and I would say that the two best candidates I have now in terms of future research that could do this under the protocols that would really convince people are going to be ones in which we have either the children who have more than one person that they're telepathic with, who also can be a communication partner involved, so that we have the person who's holding the letterboard, if that's their means of communication, be a different individual than the one who knows the answer to whatever let's say we're using random numbers or random words, but it has to be a separate individual. So that way we can try to get as much separation as possible. And then I have, I have a few, individuals in which that's the case. And then also, the kids themselves say that what's easiest for them is to engage in the telepathy with one another. And so that's also a set of experiments that I want to do. And I've already got some, preliminary data that looks like we might be able to do that, where we just have everybody, can have their own communication partner. That's not the issue, but we're actually measuring this communication between them because they really love thought sharing with one another. That's fun for them.
Yes, that is amazing. And that was one of the pieces that was so striking to me in the podcast was this idea of the talk on the hill and them actually being able to communicate with each other. Can you share a little bit more about that and how it relates to your thoughts on the idea of non-local consciousness?
Yeah, so even though I've been doing this research for well over a decade, I had never heard of the Hill before going to Atlanta to evaluate Houston and John Paul, who are two prominent children in the podcast, and they're friends with one another, and their mothers are friends with one another. And when I was down there, they talked about how, oh yeah, they go and talk on the Hill. They'll go into their bedroom. They'll put a pillow maybe over their head, and they'll astral project, go join their friends on the Hill. And I thought, when I first heard it, I thought, oh, that's quaint, that's cute. I'd never heard it before. I thought it was really maybe something between the two of them that's kind of similar to what you hear twins, talk about, where they're so close that they have this special connection. And so I thought of it that way, but I also thought it could be something bigger than that. But as I said, I'd never heard of it before. But then what happened was within a year, someone else independently mentioned, without even knowing about the Hill. They said, oh, yeah, these kids go to this place called the Hill to communicate with one another. And it's like, oh, the second person's saying that. And then we had a third person say it. And so that was really intriguing to me. Now, at this point, I mean, one of the problems was because the Telepathy Tapes talks about the Hill, and there's so much buzz about that. If anybody mentions the Hill to me now, I mean, I can't. It doesn't have the same impact that it did when you first hear it. That it's literally referred to as the Hill.
Right, that's fascinating. And so, what do you think that this is saying about consciousness and this idea that their consciousness can go to, I don't know if it's a location in space actually, but that they can go to this shared space? And I know that you have your own theory of consciousness and how this may or may work. Can you share with us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I really think that, first of all, yeah, I don't have the sense at all that there's a physical place called the Hill. I mean, this is some place that's like, let's say it's in the astral plane, where they can meet. My own thoughts about it is that I really think that I think the consciousness is is unified, is a unity. Okay, there's sort of this, let's just call it source or the noosphere or whatever you want to call it, but there's this sort of unified consciousness, and that we all have the potential to tap into that. But that what happens is that we're locked into a perspective that is informed by our usual five senses. And that perspective has survival value in that we really need to be paying attention to what's in the here and the now, that, what is it that's in our immediate environment. But what's happened is that's become all that a lot of people think we have access to. And that with these children who have their language disrupted at a very early age before acquiring language, I think that they actually keep what is a default mechanism that all of us are born with, which is an ability to actually engage in a shared consciousness, an ability that we're not as separate from source when we first enter in. If you look at infants in their first year of life, they spend a tremendous amount of time in dreaming sleep. And, it's during dreaming sleep that people say that, that we might, not be entirely in our body. It's in dreaming sleep that a lot of people will have psychic experiences that don't normally have psychic experiences. And so I think that when we all come in, we're still connected to source, and that this telepathy, this shared consciousness that we have, actually probably plays a role in the acquisition of language. That if you think about it, a child when they're in their first few years of life, I mean, they're like a sponge for language, and it's quite a complicated process to take these sounds coming out of like the sounds that are coming out of my vocal cords, now, and to actually know what the meaning is behind that. And yet people have been doing this as long as we've been speaking. And so it seems to me that what happens is that we probably have a shared consciousness, and then we learn to recognize the pattern of the sounds and associate it with, with whatever it is that we're picking up as the, in the shared consciousness field of what the person's actually thinking. And then we start to mimic it, and we start to use the language to describe it. And then what happens is that we become more and more locked into this way of communicating that uses a very linear process. I mean, very, sort of left hemisphere, very directed towards left hemisphere, linear, logical, way of communicating. Whereas with a lot of these children, because that is taken away from them so early on, they retain this more holistic or gestalt, intuitive way of accessing information.
That's fascinating. So many things came up for me as you were speaking, especially around infants and this idea of, not being limited by our five senses and how we can perceive beyond that. And there's such an overlap in various phenomenon in parapsychology, like this experience of out-of-body experiences where people can perceive information. Some tests have been done that have shown veridical perceptions when they're out of their body, and remote viewing, being able to access information from distant locations. Also this idea of shared dreams, and even shared lucid dreams, shared normal dreams, but shared lucid dreams. So, when we entertain the idea that our consciousness does go beyond our brain, beyond our physical body, then all of these phenomenon that we witness from the telepathy tapes and in parapsychology is like, oh yeah, that seems plausible. And so, it's like this dissonance between the local consciousness and this whole idea of non-local consciousness. And I just want to say one more piece, because I forgot to mention this in my presentation. I think what is so remarkable about the telepathy tapes and why it's such this huge explosion and so important, you saw the effect sizes in those experiments with the Gansfeld and Dream. I mean, they're really small, but the effect sizes with these autistics is just huge. It's like probably 0.8, 0.9, et cetera. And you just don't see that in the regular parapsychology literature. So it's just making this huge splash. So anyway, I see you nodding. Maybe you want to comment on that.
Yeah. Well, exactly. I mean, that's one of the reasons why, when I wrote my book, The ESP Enigma, and I talked about how incomplete our model is in neuroscience. We really don't understand how the brain creates consciousness yet. Science insists that it must, and then you have over 14 decades worth of research in parapsychology that, like you said, it has a statistically significant effect size, and yet that's not sufficient to move the needle. And so this is why I was like, I've got to find the population that's just going to knock people's socks off on this. And I realized that the autistic population was the most likely to do that. And then in thinking about mechanism, I was really thinking about the fact that a lot of their savant skills are right hemisphere based, and their deficits are more left hemisphere based. And that as children, their frontal lobes aren't as well developed. And so that mimics the dreaming state in terms of brain functionality, because you don't have the frontal lobes, which sort of set our expectations of what can happen, or the left hemisphere. And I'm speaking simplistically here, but the left hemisphere sort of saying, oh, well, that's illogical. It can't happen, because as we know, belief plays a huge role in what we're able to experience and perceive. And then on top of that, I really started realizing that if you think about all of these individuals who are very, very gifted psychically, a lot of them said that they did astral projection. They left their body to do so during dreams. People, it's a long history of people saying that you astral travel during dreams, and then you have people who have near-death experiences and have an out-of-body experience, and it's like that breaks open that psychological limitation that we put on ourselves in terms of who we think we are. That self as body thing gets blown wide open by people who have those out-of-body experiences. And so I saw that everything seems to point to the same thing. And when you're doing science and you see everything, leading you to the same kind of, conclusion. That it's very rewarding, and it tells you you're on the right path.
Yeah, absolutely. And, similar to that, there were other phenomenon that the non-speakers experience, like knowing languages that they hadn't learned. It's like, oh yeah, I speak Portuguese, or I speak this. And that reminded me of trans-channeling research, which of course I do, that you know about. And, trans-channelers believe that their bodies can be used as a vehicle for non-physical beings or other consciousness to speak through them. And often when they're in this trance state, they'll speak languages that the channeler themselves, when they're out of the trance state, have no clue about. Or they might have a skill like chess or playing the piano, whereas when they're out of that trance state, they don't. So I see this kind of overlap of this tapping into this broader field of information that this constrained, physical body or constrained personality consciousness may not have access to in those normal states of awareness. So I find that really fascinating. And then the other piece was around the mediumistic communications, this idea that they actually have conversations with deceased people. And I believe some of the anecdotes in the podcast were quite evidential, which is really incredible. And so obviously there's a huge body of research around mediumship, mental mediumship, etc., that's had some really fascinating findings. So I don't know, that's my kind of personal interest, but I was curious what your thoughts are on those kind of overlaps.
Yeah, well, that's a very interesting point you make about the similarity to trance channeling. And the mediumship I find really interesting, because it's what happens is that first there's a pattern to all of these families that contact me over the years. They first contact me because they are spending time with their child, who's using the letterboard or an iPad to communicate, and then they something happens that they realize, oh my gosh, this child's reading my mind, and it's not what their worldview was. Oftentimes these are medical doctors, engineers, other professionals who are just like, well, wait a minute, when I was in school, I was taught that this stuff's impossible. And then they find my name as somebody who has been researching this and contact me. And then they always inevitably say, oh, well, they thought their child was a mathematical savant, or a language savant, or a musical savant. And then they say, oh, now I know the kid's reading my mind. Then oftentimes within a year, they contact me again saying, oh my gosh, that this kid is telling me that my deceased grandmother is in the living room, and it's like, and I never even talked about my deceased grandmother, but who had a very unusual name, and yet this child seems to know it. And they're like, am I losing my mind? What's going on here? And once again I say, well, you're not the only person reporting these things. And then what's even more fascinating is that this Maria, who is a speech therapist, who's featured in the podcast, when she contacted me about these children in her office who told her about relatives of hers who came and named off two of her cousins who they said are going to be joining them soon. And literally within a month, both of those cousins died.
Wow.
So it's even more profound than just the mediumship, because of that sort of precognitive element to it.
Yes, I remember hearing about those precognitive pieces too. And, even speakers, when they receive precognitive information, it's often incredibly challenging to know what to do with that. And that was a theme that I think arose because often the information they were receiving was really disturbing and negative events. And so I think that's really important to consider moving forward. Is there a way that we can support these individuals to be able to manage in some way that information, and how to ethically be able to communicate it if it has something to do with somebody else?
Exactly. I mean, that's really one of my concerns because I mean, a lot of the podcast really brings out just all the beautiful gifts, but there's a price that comes with those gifts.
Right.
And, so I mean, one of the children who's in the podcast who had this vision that her father was going to be in an accident, slip on ice, and end up in the hospital with a broken hip. And then, a month later, he's on a business trip, and that very scenario happens. Well, how do you advise a child like that who contacts you and says she has another similar vision and really doesn't want, that family member to leave the house?
Right.
And it's, or another common thing that I get asked about is, how do we turn this off?
Yeah.
They want more mastery over it. And so until we have a better understanding of what's going on, it's harder to know how to support them as well. And so I'm very interested in that. And I'm interested in people's thoughts about how we can do that, because I really, these are very, very sensitive, gifted children that are bringing us a real gift by, their stories and sharing their gifts. And I want to give back in whatever way I can.
That's beautiful. And yeah, I talk about this quite a bit in the best practices channeling course, and this whole idea of energetic management and grounding and clearing, protecting. And I don't know how that would translate to work with non-speakers, and if they can sense into their energetic body and create visualizations to support themselves to kind of create a boundary. I don't know if that's possible, but I would be very interested in supporting that work and connecting with you more about that. We just have a couple more minutes left before our Q&A, but I was really curious about the diversity in the way the telepathic impressions arise. We've done all this work about the Noetic signature and the diversity of how people receive their intuitive capacities. And I also have learned about something called aphantasia, which is this, about that, where people they have an inability to form mental images. So I was curious about your thoughts on the different ways that these pairs actually receive the telepathic information. Sometimes it's words, sometimes it's an image, sometimes they may feel it in their body.
Right. I mean, there's different ways of receiving, or accessing the information. Well, one of the things I want to do is do a much more, now that I have at least 100 different individuals now that I can send a questionnaire out to. And we're, waiting for IRB approval, which I know you're familiar with, so that you can then publish it. And so that's why I haven't done it yet. Because I'm wanting to do it the way that you can do and then publish it. And yeah, those are the kinds of questions I want to know. I want to know, is it that, let's say it's a mother and a child, let's say, so does the mother send it visually and the child receives it visually? Can it be that the mother's thinking it as an auditory thing and the child still sees it visually, or is it always the same sense? It's that's the kind of thing that I think would be really interesting. And we know that these children have something called synesthesia, which is this sort of blending of senses. So an example of that is some of these people like Daniel Tammet, who can recite pi to 25,000 digits. He says that he just sees each number has a different color and shape to it. So, and he just reads out in space, just reads out the ticker tape like parade of these different colored shapes moving by, and that's pi for him. And so it's just effortless for him to recite it. And so this kind of pairing of color with a symbol is a common type of synesthesia, but or like a musical note and a color is another common form. And so because we know that a high percentage of these children, if not all of them, have synesthesia, it's quite possible that there could be that they're not receiving it in the same sense that it's being sent. And so, these are all, fascinating topics that I'm really looking forward to kind of getting some of the answers to.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And I hope that this work has really brought a lot more funding and support and interested researchers to support you in that process. Well, we have 55 questions in the Q&A. So I'm going to pass it to Andrea to see if she can get us started in that.
Great. Yes, I'm loving this discussion. And as you can see, we've got lots of questions. I'm going to start here with a question from Jonathan Schooler, who asks, I've heard you are doing research with the Division of Perceptual Studies at UVA. I wonder if you could describe this project. Also, will you be conferring with skeptics and magicians as well to create a protocol that can speak to the criticism that mainstream scientists will inevitably level against this work?
Yeah, well, I, because of the fact that I've been a parapsychologist for, I've been a parapsychologist for a long time. I've been a member of the Parapsychological Association for, gosh, I think it's probably 17 years now or 16 years now, quite a while. I'm very aware of what the skeptics would say. I'm very aware of the kind of protocol that they would need to see. And so I already have taken that input into consideration, and that's what I'm really trying to move towards. The question is, will I be able to achieve, that? And I'm hoping to do that, as I said, by involving more than one facilitator or having, the children in communication with one another. And then I think that once I can get that optimized, then I'd be interested to see, what they have to say about that. But I'm not there yet. I already know what they would say about things as they stand now, that there's still room for improvement. And as far as collaborating with DOPS, I'm actually doing two different collaborations now. And so one collaboration is with Marjorie Wollicott from the University of Oregon and Marina Weiler at DOPS. And what we're doing is I've provided them with my film footage of previous experiments that I had done. Some of them were prior to Kai and some of them were with Kai, for them to really kind of look at it. And we're going to do a retrospective study of that research so that we can write it up. And then we're also working on questionnaires to answer the kind of questions that we were talking about earlier about, for example, the way that they receive the information and whatnot. And then I also have a team of scientists from the University of Arizona who are experts at QEEGs, and we have a system where we could do simultaneous recordings of the telepathic pair, and you really need to have special equipment for that. I mean, this is far more specialized equipment than what you would find in your typical clinician's office to do QEEGs, because you can't have even a millisecond difference and between the two recordings. I mean, to really be looking at what's going on simultaneously. And then also we're going to be using specialized caps that are better for this population because of their sensitivity. So they won't they're just more user friendly for the kids. So those are the studies that I'm doing.
That's great. Thank you so much. Sorry, go ahead, Andrea.
Oh, no, thank you so much for that answer. Yeah, we have lots of people asking about the skepticism. So you were addressing that. And a lot of people also asking about, is this a latent capacity in all of us? So many people saying to either of you, Helané or Diane, is there ways to develop these kinds of gifts? Are they latent in everyone? Is this just an extraordinary example? So many questions like that, maybe you both can address.
Yeah, I do think it's a latent ability in all of us. I think that these kids help us to see that, as extraordinary as they are. Part of why I think that they actually teach us that it's a latent ability in all of us is that I really think it is a default mechanism that we all have. And I think that I think if you go back to, like in human evolution, let's say, and look at, Neanderthals and the hominids that were, there at the same time as Neanderthals. They there's really, reasons to think that they were communicating telepathically before language. And then what happened is that language became almost like, I wonder if language is really the true Tower of Babel, that once we started communicating by language, then, and we focus on language, then people who are growing up in different regions of the world can be using a different language. And then we've lost that universal language, which telepathy, implies that we all might have. And in terms of ways to develop it, I think that obviously, meditation is something that is really helpful. I also think that I can't emphasize enough the power of belief. One of the things that I saw happen is that after people read my book, The ESP Enigma, in which I really lay out a scientific case for, why these things might be possible, there were a number of people who were skeptics who read that book. I mean, not your diehard skeptics that, but people who were, definitely, some open-minded, but really skeptical of it. After they read my book, they said, wow, I started having these experiences. And I think that the same thing can happen for people who witness experiments in which they see, oh gosh, wow, I guess telepathy really is real. I don't doubt it anymore. And then they start having experiences. We've already started to see some of this with the telepathy tapes. A lot of people have said that the telepathy tapes was, and this didn't even contain, the video component, but just hearing these stories and whatnot was enough to cause people all around the globe to have spiritual awakenings and start to go, wow, I guess this stuff really is real. And, oh yeah, well, maybe Aunt Martha wasn't crazy after all. There's that, that kind of reaction. And so, I think that more and more people are going to have these experiences and, as a result.
Yes, I would wholeheartedly agree with everything you just said, especially highlighting the belief and some sort of mental training, whether it's meditation or something else. And then I would just add one more piece about this diversity around how it shows up. And I would invite people as they're exploring to not get super caught up in how it looks for other people. But if you believe that it's possible, and that you believe you can do it, then you engage in this exploration of how it shows up for you. Do you hear a word? Do you get an image? Do you feel it in your body? And just allowing however it shows up to be okay. And that it's not better or worse than anybody else's way, but that it's just your unique expression of how that's non-local consciousness is evolving for you.
Yeah, I would totally agree with that because for example, I took a brief remote viewing course, and I don't have aphantasia, which is that inability to form a mental image, but that's not my strong suit. And but what happens with me is that there's just a knowing. I don't know how I know it. I didn't see it as an image. I didn't hear it as a voice. I just know so gnosis, and that, and that's, I think that in some ways, that's a little more confusing when that's the way, because it's like, well, how do you know this? And how that showed up for me was that I was, I was a psychotherapist for 40 years as a practicing psychiatrist, and I would be talking with patients, and sometimes, and I really cared about them. There was this, this bond where I really wanted to understand what was going on with them. And sometimes I would say something to a patient like, well, you're feeling that way because of XYZ happening to you when you were 4 years old. And the patient would be like, Dr. Powell, that's true, that happened, but I never told you. I thought, oh, sure, no, you must have told me, No, I never told you because I have so much embarrassment around that, I would remember, if I told you that. And that happened to me more than once. And I thought, it was like I had the same knowing of it as though she had told me. It felt the same. And so I think that there's just a certain different quality to it that gives it, just where you can discern, is this just my imagination guessing, or, is this real information that I'm somehow, privy to?
That's fantastic. I experienced that too when I was seeing patients, and I would call it a download. I would just get a download. It's like I just received this packet of information fully formed. And then when I'd engage with them about it, they'd say, oh yeah, that's totally true. I wonder how many other clinicians listening or not who experience that also, but don't feel like they can really talk about it. Anyway, we could keep talking and talking about this incredible topic, but I think it's unfortunately time for us to close today. And so I would ask you, Diane, what do you think is the most important take-home message that you'd like to leave with our audience today about your profound work with non-speakers?
Wow. The most important take-home message. I would say it really has to do with our human potential. I mean, I truly believe that this is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what we are capable of as humans. And I really feel that it's an exciting time to be alive, because I think that we're really shifting into sort of a new era in which we're really going to see science and spirituality come back together again, because the message here is not just, it's showing us that our scientific paradigm's been incorrect. And it's also been showing us that there's a spirituality to there's for lack of a better word, a magic or whatever. There's something that can't be explained by science, but it still can be known, and but just through an intuitive way. And that's, I mean, Noetic sciences, that's what it's all about, And so it's about trying to bring these together. And I really think that this really could happen at this time.
Beautiful. That's so beautiful and wonderful. I'm just so deeply grateful that you were able to share this time with us today, Diane, and very excited about the incredible work that you're doing and being able to see that unfolding. And I agree, let's hold on to our seats because we're in for a big, big ride. So I would invite the audience to please stay connected with us. I mentioned a number of different research studies where you can get involved in this exact thing. So I'll pass it back to Andrea now to close us out for the day. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah, thank you so much, Diane. Thank you so much, Helané, for this incredible and really inspiring conversation. I see lots of hearts and thumbs up coming in the emojis, and just really appreciate everyone's comments, your questions. You're really being engaged in this work. Just really deeply appreciate everyone here. We'll be sending out this recording. You can share it with a loved one, along with links to follow up with Dr. Diane's work, as well as some of the experiments that Helané mentioned. So do stay involved in this work. Thank you again, everyone. And I have just a couple of announcements. on some of our upcoming programs that you all might be interested in. First, as many of you know, ION's free programs, as well as our scientific research, are almost entirely funded by the generous gifts from our members and donors. So we send such a huge gratitude to everyone who supports the mission of IONS. And if you have enjoyed today's offering, we invite you to go to noetic.org/give to become a member, or if you're already a member, to make a special gift to help keep the mission moving. And for our upcoming events, you can see a full list at noetic.org/events. We wanted to let you know that Helané has an upcoming course on the art and science of channeling deep inner wisdom, which starts in just a few days on March 10th, which is a 7-module program to enhance your intuitive abilities. So we're sharing that link in the chat now. And as many of you know, these free webinars happen every couple of weeks. So our next Free Connections Live webinar is on the playful universe, synchronicity and the nature of consciousness. So that'll be on March 21st, at 11 a.m. Pacific with Dr. Dean Radin, Marjorie Woolacott, Gary Schwartz, and David Lorimore. So we hope you will join. And our final announcement is just our Noetic Global Gatherings for members. This is a place for our IONS members to connect and to be in conversation in breakout rooms with one another. So if this is interesting to you, we are continuing this topic of telepathy. So in the next session, we'll be on mind to mind, exploring the impact of telepathy on human connection. So if you're not a member and would like to be a part of the conversation, you can sign up at noetic.org/support/membership. Okay, I think that's it for now. Thank you again, everyone, so much. Just deep, deep gratitude. Thank you, Diane, Helané, and everyone here.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
You. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.